Good morning, everybody. Ooh, that was a good response. We're doing well this morning. Hey, my name is Stephen. I'm the pastor here. It's good to have everybody. Welcome to Redemption City Church. We are wrapping up our series titled Jesus the King. Hard to believe. This is week 13. I remember on week 1, I said by the time we get to the end of this series, there's going to be a lot of things have happened. I mean, there will be, school will have begun again. The weather will begin to be changing, which it is. Lindsay and I will be getting ready to have a baby, which we are. By the way, this is going to be Lindsay's last week leading worship up until like October. And so she'll be off. Everything's good. Everything's fine. But we got a great team that God has given us. And so they'll kind of take us all the way through the month of September. Lindsay will get a little break. And a lot has happened this summer. A lot has happened through this series. And God's done some really good work, I think, in our hearts. And I know many of you have shared how either reading the Tim Keller book or through a Sunday morning, how God has been moving in your life. And so what we want to do this morning is kind of wrap this series up. But like is true of Jesus, when something ends, it's not really the ending. It's the beginning. And so this is the ending of a series, and we're going to end where most people think a story should end, upon a death. But we don't end there because Jesus didn't end there. When that story ended, the real story just began. And so this morning, we're in Mark chapter 16. We're going to be reading through verses 1 through 8, which in the ESV translation is entitled The Resurrection. Now, a lot has happened, and we kind of skipped a bunch. If you were here last week, we last left Jesus in the garden. He was suffering, for lack of a better term. He had seen the judgment of God coming upon him, or that it would be coming. He had prayed those famous prayers that he prayed in the garden, saying those famous words, "Not my will, but your will be done." That's where we left our king. Well, again, a lot has happened since, or until this point in Mark chapter 16. He was, of course, betrayed with a kiss. He was wrongfully accused and mocked by his Jewish brothers and handed over to Rome. He was then wrongfully tried, illegally even, and then condemned to death. He was beaten. He was bruised. He was forced to carry his own cross. And then he was hung upon that cross, where, of course, he faced the physical torment of crucifixion, but also was forsaken by his Father, where he uttered those famous words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And then he uttered the other famous words, the hopeful words, "It is finished," where he completed the work of our redemption. He was then cut with a spear to prove his death and to fulfill prophecy. He was taken off that cross. A wealthy man named Joseph of Arimathea took the body, put it in his own family's tomb. This is all what has happened between last week and where we're at this morning in Mark chapter 16. Now, here's a temptation that you and I might have as we work our way through this message. You might say, "Isn't this an Easter message?" Let me tell you something. Every message ought to be an Easter message. Every message is the resurrection of Christ, because outside of the resurrection of Christ, this is just a really good story. But with the resurrection of Christ, there is transformation. There is the gospel. There is new life. And so this morning, we don't just preach a message that is preached once a year in the spring. We preach the message that ought to be preached every single week, that Christ has been resurrected. And so we look this morning at this passage. If you have a Bible, open it up, Mark chapter 16. We're in verse 1. We're going to move our way through it. It starts like this. It says, when the Sabbath was past. The Sabbath, of course, in Jewish culture was late Friday night to Saturday night. And so Jesus was crucified on a Friday, and his body was taken off, and then that next 24 hours or so was Sabbath. And so they were unable to do anything with the body because it was Sabbath. That Sabbath was perhaps the worst of all Sabbaths. It seems like religion had won. The disciples were mourning, cowering in fear on that Sabbath. The Christ was sleeping, and the world was waiting. And we'll see in this story, by the very fact of what these women are going to be doing in this story, that they did not trust God the way that they had ought. By the very nature of what they were doing, which was going to the tomb with spices to cover the body, means that they thought he was dead and he was staying dead. But it says this, that the Sabbath had passed. That Sabbath day, you could say, actually is like the middle point of history. Not necessarily chronologically, but more so that everything before that day and everything after that day is different. Everything before that day was pre-Christ's resurrection. Everything post that day is Christ resurrected. It's kind of like this. When I run, which is like the worst thing ever, when I run and you get to that point where you turn around and you're going home, you don't even have to do anything. You just feel better. Because you know I'm now getting closer to the end of this run. On the other side of the resurrection, this is true. We are now every day closer to the day of full redemption. We are closer to the day of Christ's full return. We are closer to the day when all things are restored. That is a turning point we're celebrating. So that Sabbath passed. It passed. It was over. That day of great despair. I don't know who had faith on that day. And if it wasn't the disciples and it wasn't these three women, I don't know who it was who had faith on that day. But it passed. Then Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. This is a typical thing to do, to go to a body and to anoint it with spices post-mortem. And so they would go and they were going to do this. Now, also see what Mark is doing here. He has referenced these individuals at the death, at the crucifixion, and now he's referencing them again in what is going to be the resurrection. Mark is not just referencing them for the point of the story. He's also referencing them for historical accuracy because he's not writing legend. He's writing historical fact, and he is indeed building a case for the accuracy of the crucifixion and the resurrection story. These women, they saw the death and they saw the resurrection. This is not legend. This is not folklore. This is fact. In fact, I think we could sum up a lot of our faith in this. Do you believe he actually died and was resurrected? As one author says, if you can predict your own death and resurrection and then do it, you win. He did. And so they went. These three. Who knows what they were feeling? I mean, we can probably conjecture. They had put their hope in a king. They'd seen that king murdered on a cross. And the only thing they really have left to do with the king is to go and put some spices on his body. Maybe hope crushed, dreams shattered. And as they approached the tomb very early on the first day of the week, Sunday, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they were saying to one another, because you have to talk about something on the way to Jesus' dead body. And they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? It was massive. It was a huge stone. And this is the conversation Mark tells us about, that they were just asking that question. Who will remove this obstacle? Who will take away the obstacle that is impeding us from getting to Jesus' body? Who will move away the stone? And we're going to see in another sentence that it was very large. These women actually didn't know that there was another obstacle actually in their way from getting to the body. Soldiers. There had been soldiers placed there. So there was actually two obstacles stopping them from getting to what they wanted. A massive stone and some soldiers. It's a beautiful, beautiful picture, actually. A beautiful picture that prior to that moment, there had been something that impeded our ability to get to Christ. Sin. Massive. Just like these women were incapable of removing the stone on their own, you and I are and were incapable of removing our obstacle on our own. We can't remove sin by our own good actions, our own good deeds, or anything we could ever do. The women are going to show up at the tomb and they're going to see that somebody removed the obstacle for them, God, in the same way that on the cross, Christ removed our obstacle by conquering it. And so these women show up. And the obstacle, the one thing that was stopping them from Jesus' body, they get there and looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. And then Mark throws in there, it was very large. Can you see these three women? And all the things that they're feeling. They walk up, and they see the stone rolled away. And I wonder what they were feeling. Was it nervousness? Was it fear? Was it a bit of hope? Like maybe that thing he did say about resurrecting is true? Because it all seems to point by what they were going to do that they didn't think he was actually going to raise from the dead. So they walk in the tomb. Entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed because that's kind of creepy. They walk in, and there's just a guy. Now, back then, the white would symbolize purity. It would symbolize some type of reverence, even some type of royalty. But they walk in, and they just see a guy who they know is not the king, Jesus. They just see him sitting there in the tomb. They thought they were going to the place of Jesus' death. They thought they were going to the place where religion won. They thought they were going to the place where the natural course of the world had taken over and conquered the king. That's what they thought they were walking into. They were indeed very wrong. Entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed, afraid, shocked, whatever. And he said to them, because the scary people always say this, do not be alarmed. If I was going to title this sermon, I would call it, Listen to the Creepy Guy. Because he says three things in here. This is, by the way, he's really the first evangelist. The first one. He's the first one who tells of the resurrection. And so in the very first evangelist, this is what he says. First, don't be alarmed. Don't be afraid. These women had every reason in the world to be afraid. Every reason. They had seen religious leaders who should have been on the side of Jesus crucify him. They saw the Roman soldiers beat him. They knew that discussion had been had about people trying to steal his body, and so that they were already making ways to make sure that that didn't happen. They also knew that they had talked about potentially, like Peter was scared. Why? For a reason. Like their men in their life were cowering in fear. They had every reason to be afraid. And what does he say to them? Don't be afraid. Don't be alarmed. Don't be alarmed. Now, how does somebody live unafraid? How do we live unafraid when you have every reason to be scared? And why? Why were they alarmed? Why were they afraid? I'll go back to this. Because they didn't really yet trust that every prophecy about the resurrection, that Jesus' own words about his resurrection were true. They didn't yet fully trust that everything the Father and the Son had said was going to happen. The other day I was riding my bike. And as I was riding my bike, I'm going in, and I was riding by a neighborhood, and I saw very briefly, it's amazing what you can see so quickly, very briefly, I saw what looked like a 3 or 4-year-old be picked up by his dad and then jump off a diving board into a pool. And then I just, kept writing. And as I was doing that, I had some memories come back to me of my own self at a younger age being terrified to jump into a pool off a diving board. If you have young kids, you've probably experienced this before. And I actually have memories of my own dad grabbing me, holding me, running off the diving board, jumping into the water. And then, of course, I would freak out and start kicking and punching him because I thought I was going to get held under and drown and all of that kind of stuff. Guess what? Now I'm 31 and I can jump into a pool all by myself. Thank you. Thank you. But before I couldn't. I was terrified of something that I should not have been terrified of. And it was my father's embrace and trusting my father that got me past the point of my fear. These women had not yet fully trusted the Father or the Son. He had told them, I'm going to do this. They still yet didn't fully believe it. But he tells them, do not fear. Do not be alarmed. Isn't it amazing that the story of Jesus at the beginning of the Gospels and the story here at the end start and end with the same words? Don't be afraid. What did the angels say at the beginning? Do not fear. What do they say at the end? Do not fear. And I repeat it to you. Do not be alarmed. Do not fear. I know it's scary. I know it doesn't always go the way you want. I know that all of these circumstances that could swim through your mind right now of all of the things that could go wrong or all the things that do go wrong or all of the things that you watch on the news or all of the things that you think about for your kids or all of the things for your business or whatever it might be can begin to bring fear. But the words of the gospel at the beginning and at the end are do not fear. Let the Father embrace you. Trust what he says and do not fear. It's the first thing he says to them. Then he says this. You seek Jesus of Nazareth. By the way, this is Mark again, making sure that people see the historical side of this. The same Jesus, the one who was born in Nazareth, the one who we've been talking about all along, that Jesus. You seek Jesus of Nazareth. Oh, that's why they were there. They were there because they sought the Christ. But what Christ did they seek? They sought a Christ that they thought was dead. They sought a Christ that they thought was still in the tomb and whose body they needed to preserve. That's the Christ that they sought. And kudos to them. I mean, what great love that they did have for Jesus, that they would seek him even in that. But how much more ought we to seek the King when we read this next line? You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. And these are the next three words. The three words that are spoken at every Easter Sunday. The three words that the Apostle Paul later writes in 1 Corinthians 15 that are potentially the most essential three words in the Christian faith. And three words that mark history as the turning point. Three words. He has risen. He has risen. In other words, he's not dead. He's not in the tomb. He isn't here. In fact, that's the very next thing he says, just so they understand. He has risen. He is not here. They expected to find Jesus in his death in the tomb. They went in. They were in fear because the angel told them not to fear, and so apparently they had a look of fear. Maybe that fear was that religion had indeed won. or that they needed to be afraid of the powers of the world, of Pilate or the Roman soldiers or whoever it might be. But when these words are spoken, he has risen. He is not here. Everything ought to have changed. Because in that moment, everything that had ever been spoken from the beginning of time was proven to be true. In that moment, religion totally lost its power. And so the idea that you need to earn anything or do anything or work hard enough to obtain something is gone. In that moment, the world that threw everything it had, we talked about this earlier in the series, the worst thing that the world can throw at someone is death. It's the worst because it just ends everything. And in the moment of death, there is no hope. As long as there is life, there is some hope. But when there is no life, there is no hope. And so the world threw its worst at Jesus and lost. Lost. He has risen. He is not here. He is not in the place of his death. He is not in the place of defeats. And friend, when you are in Christ, you too no longer have to stay in the tomb. You don't have to stay in death. You don't have to stay in darkness. You don't have to stay in despair. You don't have to stay in enslavement. You don't have to be enslaved to sin. You don't have to be enslaved to religion or to the law. You don't have to be enslaved to fear. You do not have to stay in the tomb. You get to walk out of it. As Christ is risen, you are risen. As Christ was free from the tomb, you are free from the tomb. He's not here. Imagine if they would have just stayed there. Just sat in the tomb. Just sat there. Listen, a Christian who still lives in enslavement, either to sin or to the law. A Christian who still lives just a partial understanding of the gospel and the truth of its freedom. It would be the equivalent of Mary and this woman just staying in the tomb. But they walk out of it. Do not be alarmed. You see Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. Look upon it. Then instead, he gives them the third piece. This is the third thing you do. But go and tell. Tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. He's not here. He has risen. Now go and tell people. Go and tell everyone what has happened. Now, these women are going to become the first human evangelists. The angel was the first one to them, and then they're the second round, or the first people. Imagine that title. You're the first evangelist. Because what does evangelist do? What does evangelist? It shares the good news of the gospel. That he has risen, that he's no longer in death, and because he has risen, now you too can rise. And so, you and I, many of us, we've journeyed through, and if this is your first week, that's okay, because you get all of it in 1 week. We've journeyed through the Gospel of Mark. We titled it very simply, Jesus the King. Telling of a story of a man on earth who lived it perfectly, unlike anyone else had done. We looked at the beginning, how he began to tell who he was. Then he transitioned into why he had come. And then that moved on to him doing what he had come to prove who he was. All along asking this question, is he your king? Is he your king? And here we have the ending. But it's not an ending at all. It's really just the beginning. It's the beginning of the better story. And he says at the end, just go and tell. Go and tell. So if you were going to go and tell, what would you go and tell? You could tell of his love and his mercy for all of those that he met along the way. You could tell how you have met the King and how he called you by name because he's personal. You could tell how you were one thing, but now you're something altogether new. You could tell how you made a decision to follow the King because you've never looked upon something quite as beautiful as the gospel. That you, in all of your sin, were dead, and Christ, in all of his perfection and grace, took upon all of your sin so that you could all have all of his perfection. There is nothing more beautiful to gaze upon than that. You could tell how you have been healed by the King from the inside out. How he was with you in despair, but he healed the broken heart. You could tell how the King has provided you rest. Rest from your weariness. Rest from the constant struggle and strife. Rest from constantly trying to get ahead of the person next to you or even of your own expectations. But finally in Christ, you found rest because you realized he did all of the work for you. You could tell of the King's strength in the midst of your storm. The hardest storm that you've ever gone through, but he didn't leave you in the middle of it. In fact, he delivered you out of it. And on the other side of the storm was an intimacy with him that you would have never known had you not gone through the storm. And you can tell how you can approach the King no matter who you are, because you saw the stories that all people were invited to come and to experience his redemption and the grace and the love that was in his gaze. And you could tell how you have given up everything for the King, because everything you tried to obtain on your own all paled in comparison to the King. And you could tell how you now see the King as greater than anything this world has to offer. And you live open-handed because what you have in the King is so much better than anything you've built yourself. And you could tell how your King came to die, and that he did die, and then he stared down the barrel of God's judgment. He looked right at it, and he didn't walk away from it. Instead, the cup of God's wrath was poured out on the King. It killed him. But that wasn't the end of the story. And then you could finally tell how he is not a dead king. He's not still in the grave. He is a risen king. He is your king. He is Jesus the King.